Every deal can sound good out of the gate until the risk shows up. The price is clear, the structure is outlined, the headline number feels strong. And then one question quietly determines whether the deal actually works. Do the clients stay? Because in this business, that's the deal. Everything else is just terms around that. Let me tell you about Laura. Laura ran a $300 million practice, deep relationships, decades with many of her clients. When she decided to transition, she approached it the right way, not by asking, what's the highest multiple I can get, but by asking, how do I make sure this works for everyone involved? She found a strong buyer, good cultural fit, proven platform, clear transition plan. And then they structured the deal, not around price first, but around risk. They agreed that for the first phase of the transition, the key variable was retention. It's always retention. So part of the consideration was tied to that outcome. Transition payments, holdbacks tied to client retention, clear timelines. And importantly, Laura accepted that early on, the risk sat with her. She was the one with the relationships. She's the one with the trust. Fast forward 18 months, clients stayed, relationships transferred. The new firm proved itself. At that point, the dynamic shifted. The buyer now owned the relationships, not just legally, but practically. The buyer now carried the responsibility and the risk, the financial risk, of ongoing retention. The deal worked, not because risk was avoided, but because it was understood, minimized, and then allocated properly over time. Here's a core reality. Every deal has risk. You don't eliminate it, you structure it. And in practice transitions, the primary risk is straightforward. Client retention. It's not markets, it's not operations, not even valuation. It's retention, because the entire value of the business depends on whether clients stay through the transition and beyond it. There's 3 keys to minimizing and allocating risk. Key number 1, retention risk starts with the seller, and that's appropriate. Early in a transition, the seller holds the relationships. Clients trust the advisor, not the logo on the statement. That's been built over years, often decades. So when a transition happens, clients are not evaluating the buyer independently. They're taking a signal from the selling advisor. That's why in well-structured deals, retention risks sits with the seller in the early phase. That's typically the first 18 to 24 months, can be longer. And that shows up in structure, transition-based payments, holdbacks tied to retained revenue or assets, performance-based components. This isn't punitive, it's alignment. The person who carries the outcome carries the risk. Here's key number 2. Risk should shift and timing matters. Here's where good deals separate from average ones. The risk doesn't stay with the seller forever. It's a defined period, often 1 or 2 years. The expectation is clear. The buyer should have earned the client relationships. They should have built trust, established continuity, integrated the client experience. At that point, retention is no longer driven by the seller. It's driven by the buyer. So the risk shifts, and it should. Because if the buyer hasn't established those relationships by then, that's not a seller problem anymore. That's an execution issue on the buyer's side. Key number 3, sellers, pay attention to this. You don't get top multiples without taking some risk. This is where expectations need to be grounded. You can't have it both ways. As a seller, you cannot ask for the highest valuation, the most cash up front, and zero exposure to retention risk. That combination doesn't exist, because from the buyer's perspective, they're acquiring a stream of relationships. If those relationships don't hold, the value changes, obviously. So in strong deals, higher valuations are paired with performance-based components, retention-linked structures, time-based transition payments. That's not a flaw. That's the mechanism that makes higher outcomes possible. And therefore, as a seller, what's the number one thing to remember? The quality of the buyer directly impacts retention. Not all buyers are equal. And this is where many advisors make a critical mistake. They focus on the headline number instead of the probability of retention, because the math is simple. A little bit lower offer with a 98% retention outperforms a higher offer with an 80% retention every time. Stronger platforms deliver higher retention because they bring better systems, more consistent client experiences, deeper teams, proven transition processes. That doesn't guarantee success, but it increases the probability, and in a retention-driven deal, probability is what you're banking on. And this ties back to everything we've discussed. This isn't an isolated concept. It connects directly to succession. Clients follow trust. Aggregators, platforms built to absorb and retain relationships. Equity outcomes only realized if clients stay. Retention is the thread that runs through all of it. Without it, there is no transition, there is no growth, there's no second bite. So when you look at a deal, don't start with price, start with risk. Ask yourself, where does retention risk sit today? When does it shift? Who controls the outcome at each stage? Then structure around that. Minimize the risk that you can, and then be deliberate about who takes what remains. Here's my final takeaways. If you're approaching a succession, there are two realities to keep in mind. First, retention risk is yours early on, and that's not a disadvantage. It's a reflection of the value you've built. Second, the quality of the buyer matters as much as the price they offer, because the real outcome isn't what's written on that paper, it's what actually stays in place after the transition. The deals that work, the ones that maximize outcomes for both sides, they don't ignore risk, they respect it, they minimize it first, and then they assign it clearly, fairly, and over time. That's what turns a good deal into a successful one. If you found this episode helpful and you're a practice owner interested in understanding succession options, reach out to an Advisor Hunt consultant for a confidential discussion. And if you'd like to get into more detail on the topic of succession, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to be the first to get future episodes. I'm Darrell with Advisor Hunt. It's good to have you here, and we'll see you next time.